Welcome back to the Hive. We've got a full house panel again today. So welcome to Charlotte Dahl, Kathy Brown and Lorna Leeson. And today is part two of our discussion on toxic cultures. We had a great discussion last time on the subject and really did get some fabulous input and interaction. So thank you to everyone on Twitter and LinkedIn who's commented and joined the debate and put their two penneth in to what is clearly a topic that struck a chord with lots of people. But what we found last time is that we had a lot more to discuss. We had a lot more that we wanted to talk about. So this time we're going to focus on what to do when you find yourself dealing with a toxic culture. How do you handle it? How do you heal it? Can you even heal it? And as usual, I'm going to be asking each of our Hive panel to give us a quick start of a 10 before we open up the discussion more broadly.
Okay, I'm going to quickly talk about tone of voice in internal communication when you're trying to deal with a toxic fallout. And my first point to make is that internal tone of voice should be a reflection of, not a carbon copy of your external voice. And then the idea is that you flex that voice with internal communication, playing the elements of your tone of voice up or down, depending on your audience and message internally. So managing the expose of a toxic culture takes internal communication of the greatest sensitivity. So what you need to do is dial up your EQ and leave your anarchic, playful, tongue-in-cheek, irreverent aspect of your tone of voice, your external personality, well away from employee comms at this time. It's about speaking plainly, avoiding cliches and empty platitudes. So that's what I think.
Thank you. It's interesting, actually. Last time, Kathy talked about the absence of trust being something that was common to many organisations where we were seeing toxic cultures. And of course, a consistent tone of voice and communications written in a consistent tone of voice that people can trust are very, very important.
Yeah, but my overriding point is that you don't just take your external tone of voice and slap it internally. And I'm saying this from things I've seen from certain toxic culture exposés recently, where they've just taken verbatim their external tone of voice and slapped it right down in the faces of their people. And that's not how you do it. It's about taking aspects and elements of your tone of voice externally and nuancing it for your audience, playing those tones up or down depending on the message. And when you're dealing with something like a toxic culture expose internally, you need to be playing all your sensitive human aspects of your personality.
Kathy, how do we handle a toxic culture? How do we heal a toxic culture? Can we?
Indeed. I've come at it from the leadership element, very much so. And I think there's a number of nuances around the situation that you're dealing with, which will then drive how you deal with it. So are we talking a loss of trust? Are we talking a loss of trust that impacts internally our employees, externally our customers, both? What's going on? Is it a long-term thing, or is it a sudden incident that's happened? And even, you know, with you as a leader, are you accepting responsibility because genuinely it's a mistake you've made, or are you accepting responsibility for something that has happened as an organisation and you are the captain and essentially you're going down with the ship? So I think all of those things impact how you as a leader would approach coming back from it. But for me, the biggest thing that you've got to bear in mind is that it's going to take time. Whatever you're doing, it's not going to be a quick fix, even if it's a sudden problem that you've come across rather than a long-term build-up. You've got to accept it's going to take that time. You've got to be genuine about what's happened. And I think that's one of the hardest things, to be genuine, admit fault if that's appropriate, but to not be defensive about what's going on, and just to be the wholehearted, I got that wrong, we got that wrong as an organisation, whatever the scenario is. And to be aware that your people are likely to need time and possibly help to understand their feelings about it. So they're not just going to take your apology and move on. You know, you've got to do the work. You've got to do the work to regain that trust. And I think sort of finally, to just finish off that bit, prevention is better than cure. Don't get into that position in the first place. Look at the 4 enablers and start there. It builds that culture so that you haven't got to deal with this scenario.
Excellent. Lorna, what's your take on moving this forward?
I'm going to start at the very beginning, I guess, and then, I've got, unsurprisingly, other things to say. The moment that this is, I think the way that Charlotte framed this as an expose, I think that actually, imagine being the leader that gets this feedback smack, right? Or it goes public, that Twitter post that we saw a few weeks ago is released. That's actually going to be quite a visceral response for you as a leader. That's going to be a big shock. And so the first thing that I would say is, as a leader, as a leadership team, stop, pause is the first thing to do, because normal human responses to that kind of event happening will be that you may feel under attack, you may take it personally, you may therefore flip to defensiveness and denial, as Kathy said. Your response might be something different. It might be to go on the attack, to go on the offensive. Whatever it is that you might do when you've experienced that kind of shock, just stop and pause. And if we go back to what we talked about last time with the recent example with Brewdog, you actually saw that play out. You saw the initial reaction and then the more considered reaction. And the more considered reaction, as Charlotte has said, has got the empathy of process behind it to think about, well, what's the message we really need to deliver here, and how do we want that people who are reading that to feel? And you haven't given yourself time or space to do that if you just react straight away, and it will feel like you have to react straight away. I'm not saying sit there for a week, right, saying nothing, but do pause, and then get some good people in the room who can help advise you on what to do next. Get good people in the room to advise. And that's not just your lawyer and your PR person, right? That is people who understand your employees, your culture, how people are really feeling and how to work with them going forwards.
Right, thank you. It's interesting, isn't it? I'm struck by the point you talked about. Charlotte used the word expose. You did, sort of slap in the face when something like this suddenly comes and hits you. But actually, the reality, of course, is that in most situations, you're not going to be faced with such a public denunciation as say, let's come back to the Brewdog example. That isn't generally the norm, that suddenly there's this massive, great public unveiling of something that you are completely unaware of, that just sort of smacks you in the face and you think, oh my goodness, where did that come from? That's not always what happens. In fact, I would probably suggest it's actually
but also
a minority of cases.
Yeah, but I would argue that actually they knew full well what was going on, but they decided that they weren't going to face it until someone blew the whistle.
That's
it's
probably
never the case that nobody knows.
No,
it's toxic, and suddenly it comes as a great big surprise.
Absolutely, and I think Engage for Success co-founder Nita Clark has this wonderful phrase, doesn't she, which is that employee voice is the best smoke alarm you will ever have. So that's where I was going with that, was to say, it's not about waiting for something like that to hit the public arena and respond. How do you find out? How do you know what is going on? How do you properly get a sense of what the culture really is like inside your organisation? And how do you know that, how do you know whether you've got toxic situations occurring in silos all around the place or not?
I mean, if you're in the least, if you're in the least empathetic, you should just, unless you hold yourself up in your office as a leader, you should be able to tell from body language within your organisation of people you can see. You would hope that you are asking people within your organisation how they feel, whether you're doing that personally or via survey or whatever else. And you would also like to think that you are reflecting and taking that on board. But obviously what we see is that leaders don't do that.
Kathy, I think you'd be surprised, and I'm sure you know as much as any, how little organisations still ask their people. They still rely on an annual, or worse still, the biannual survey to tap into what their employees think.
I know, and there's never any substitute for literally just going and talking to people. It's something that I've always advocated, and I don't care how big your organisation is, you can still do that. You really, really can. And if you aren't doing that as a leader, then I think you haven't understood leadership properly.
And you can still do that even in a hybrid workplace. You can still do that when X proportion of your workforce may be perhaps working remotely or working from home, because you can, if you're creative and you want to, you can find ways to tap into that. You can join team calls, you can have those kind of interactions and conversations. Just like Jo Dodds said at the last conversation, she talked about emotional intelligence, didn't she? Being one of the tools in our armoury to help deal with this, and leadership very often lacking that emotional intelligence to perhaps have that empathy.
And you've still got to be prepared to do something with it as well.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Lorna, what were you? I've
got a slightly different take. So there's a metaphor about culture being like the water that we swim in, right? So it's all around us. Culture is the way that we do things around here. One way of describing it, right?
Yeah.
And if you live in it, it's the metaphor goes something like, it's like asking a fish to describe the water that they're in, right? And I'm never really surprised by the number of conversations between employees and leaders when people start talking about culture. The first time, and I've been privileged to witness the first time somebody is brave enough to say, hey, we do this thing. And what very often happens is it's either diminished, or it's brushed off, or it's denied. And I've seen it probably 3 times this week, to be completely honest, and it's only Thursday. That's just human. It's just human nature. Because John Amici, who is on Twitter and is the director of, he's an occupational psychologist, but he also used to be an NBA basketball player. I love him to pieces. He says that your culture is defined by the worst behaviour that you're willing to tolerate as a leader. So, and that just slips by. So I think one of the first things you can do is you can have an alarm go off. Anytime anyone says, oh, that's just Bob, that's just the way it's always been done, that's just working in a bar, it's always been like that. That's just warehouses.
Yes. Okay, but what if the toxicity comes from the top then? What then?
So this is where the leaders fit in, Charlotte. So that the second part to that is having enough humility, and I can't think of another word than humility, really. Humility and actually courage to say, I've been talking to clients recently about culture happening at 2 levels, and I use the ADKAR model, which is a model for change, which is awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement as a process that you might go through to change something. So if you think about it from a culture point of view, awareness is, this is how we are, and how we want to be different, and desire is, yeah, I buy into that. But then you've got 2 layers when you talk about leaders and culture change. You've got awareness of, yeah, this is how we are and we want to be different. That sounds good. I don't want us to have a culture of fear, or, I want us to be an inclusive organisation. That's level 1, awareness and desire. Level 2 is, oh, I do things that are part of that culture. There are things that I do that are reinforcing that day in or day out, or things that I don't do, or things that I don't call people to account on. And I want to do something different. So as a leader, you've got to be willing to examine and change your own behaviour and beliefs and values. And that's the hardest part. It takes
also you've got to be brave, and you've got to want to hear uncomfortable truth.
Yeah, humility and courage.
And you've got to encourage those, and you've got to create these forums for listening, and you've got to be prepared to pull your big boy pants right up and hear some really uncomfortable,
or girl pants,
or lady pants, depending.
Oh, we're going
all sorts of pants. But to face uncomfortable truths, and to use them as an opportunity to change for good and not put your head in the sand. And Joe and I have worked with many organisations who either just have their heads in the sand or who know they have a toxic culture, and they are so brave and they are so nervous, but they are determined to do something about it. And we've seen them head off toxicity. We've seen them stop it and change it. So leaders need to be empathetic, but they also need to be brave.
Yeah, and I think we hit here the problem we have with leadership culture still. I mean, not just in this country, but I think worldwide, which is that we value ego to some degree. We really do. And so, you know, if you're not an egotistical person in that way, you struggle to be seen as a good leader, a strong leader. And so humility is not something we currently value in that leadership position.
So here's a live example, Gareth Southgate, which is topical. So he's a great example of this. He's a really great example of this. And up until this week, I think people were looking for his head on a stick, weren't they? Because they thought he's not the chest-beating leader that we need to get us through this. But if you look at what he did, one of the first things that he did when he took over the team is he said, okay, guys, we're going to go and meet with the media. We're going to have a conversation. We've always had a combative relationship with the media, both ways. We're going to sit down and build that relationship. That takes courage and that takes humility. I think somebody who he role models courage and humility for me. He had the courage of his convictions to say, this is how I'm going to play it. This is what I'm going to do. And the humility to listen. And if you listen to the players talk about the team ethos and how they feel valued and how they feel that it's, you know, so closely knit. There's some big personalities in that team and some big players who, you know, are sitting on the bench and they're happy to sit on the bench and wait for their moment. You don't get that in every team culture. He's a great example.
The letter he wrote about taking the knee and about how his belief is that they have more to say than just football is just, I thought it was jaw-dropping. It was one of the best things I'd read for years. It was fabulous. It really was.
He's a brilliant example of the qualities of a leader personified. And actually this is reminding me, I want to go back and remind myself, I wrote a blog 4 years ago now. What would that have been about? Oh, the Euros last time round. And it was all about his approach to his team and building his team and bringing on their strengths and working with them as a group. If I remember rightly, and I will go back and have a look. But you're right; he's an excellent example. But isn't it interesting? Humility and courage, they're both really important. But actually, you could argue, people would think, well, how can you have both? You know, how can you be the big?
We think courage is this.
Yes,
right? we think courage is.
But it is.
Courage is taken from the word for heart. It's about compassion. It's about having heart. And courage isn't the absence of fear, as Charlotte said earlier on. It's about being terrified and doing it anyway. Which,
Well, and of course, Jacinda Ardern is obviously another excellent example of a leader who leads with both of those qualities at the centre of herself.
They're out there. And they're coming through more and more. So I agree with Kathy in terms of our predominant leadership model historically has not been that. And there is some research that says in times of trouble, we do look for leaders who are of the chest beating type, but I think we've experienced some recently, and maybe, you know, we're starting to see that that's not the only way to do things. So definitely humility and courage. And I think what Gareth Southgate did, so we're talking about culture change in football to a certain extent, because he's talking about players taking the knee, raising the conversation about racism and Black Lives Matter and what that means for a team that have a lot of black players and supporters, and wanting to have a culture where actually that, you know, it's inclusive. And what he was doing was he was not accepting the worst behaviour as a leader. He was calling people out, and he took that responsibility. He did and said the hard thing, and he put himself up there. He didn't wait for one of his team to do it. He put himself up there.
And I think actually that leads on to a really important point about behaviours. And toxic cultures will often arise in an absence of behaviours and in absence of managing your culture. I mean, there's the SALTS report on the back of the LIBOR scandal with Barclays several years ago. It's a really good example where they laid the blame. The SALTS report laid the blame for the LIBOR scandal firmly at the door of toxic cultures created by silos as a result of no clear sense of organisational value.
So a vacuum. We fill a vacuum.
And I thought, I mean, that it's such an important point, that having frameworks of behaviours, and actually within those behaviours, allowing people to call out bad behaviour, empowering people to do that, is a really important way that you can manage your culture as much as you manage your brand, which is clearly important and missing in many organisations.
And comes back to what we were talking about in part one of this session, wasn't it? That if you treat your culture as some kind of marketing tool, rather than actually thinking about how do you make your brand come to life internally through a culture that is aligned and behaviours that are joined up to create a true sense of that culture, then the gap will just, I think you said it yourself, Lorna, the gap will just get wider and wider and wider.
Yeah, it does. And I think the thing about the behaviours and culture being just the way that we do things around here is there are all sorts of things that impact behaviour. So laying them out intentionally and clearly and reinforcing them is absolutely something we should do. But if you think about the ways that behaviour is reinforced on a day-to-day basis in a business, the structure that you operate by, how decisions get made, the processes that you follow, formally and informally, where power and influence sits, who really gets to make decisions.
Yes.
So you have to look at all of those things in a system to really think about and I call them culture levers. You know, what are the levers that you need to pull to really have that impact? And you can only do that if you've been really clear and intentional, as Charlotte has said, about these are our values and these are the behaviours, which are values in action. I know that's a Woodreed, phrase that you guys use often, but that's absolutely, it's the clearest way of describing it for me. Your behaviours are your values in action.
But the other thing to do is to make sure that you're not seeing these things in isolation. I think you probably just made that point, Lorna, that a lot of organisations see values and behaviours here, and then processes here, and then organisational objectives here, and sort of vision there. And actually everything is intrinsic and is interconnected, and you need to see it all as one joined up piece and not in bits.
Yeah, absolutely.
The iceberg model of culture, essentially.
Yes, absolutely. So this isn't going to happen. We're not going to be able to fix these things overnight. We can't heal them overnight, but they can be healed by taking a holistic approach, by applying humility, by being courageous, and by taking the time to really think about not only how you live your values, how you behave on a day-to-day basis, how your leadership model those values, but also how your systems and processes and structures enable or get in the way of that. Lorna? Yeah?
Yeah, and I think what comes up then is that you have to make some tough decisions. So it's one thing to say, we really want to be an inclusive business, a creative business. And then at some point you got to put your money where your mouth is, right? So if the thing that is really impeding your creativity is that no one's got any time because you've resourced yourself to a level where actually there's a whole bunch of people who haven't got any time, and you have to put your money where your mouth is to change that. So you actually get to a nub in some of this work where you've got to do something that's hard, and you've got to do something that's different to what you did before. Be that, changing a system completely, changing a process that you've always relied on, putting money somewhere else. It will come down to making a tough decision at some point. It's not easy.
I'm going to just add, can I just add two more points to what you said? Is that listening to your people is absolutely key. Constantly listening to your people is key, and also clear communication is absolutely important as well, because if you don't tell people, if you don't communicate clearly, people will fill in the gaps or make it up for themselves. And that's when little pockets of toxicity will start to develop.
I knew you were going to say that, because I was thinking, as Lorna was just speaking, I was thinking the thing that we need to say, and I'm glad you said it there, Charlotte, because if you hadn't, I would have. We've got to communicate what we're doing while we're doing this. We've got to be honest and open and transparent about the why and the what, because yeah, you're absolutely right, people will fill in the gaps otherwise. So anything just to sort of add to that, Kathy?
I'm going to reiterate prevention rather than cure. You know, if this is ringing any bells with anybody out there that's experiencing this or experiencing this as a leader, work on yourself, do the work. You know what you should be doing, have the courage to do it.
Courage again, absolutely. Good, thank you. It's been great, another fabulous conversation. Charlotte, Kathy, Lorna, thank you very much. And thanks for watching, thanks for listening, get involved in the debate, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.